Radio Mano Papachango.
Hey Chris, Ben here. You hear all that? If you can, it's the sound of the Amazon jungle at night. I'm sitting out here looking over this small pond. There are water lilies blooming on it, just like they do every night, light against the darkness. I'm here at this Ayahuasca center in the jungle. I've been here for almost 6 weeks now, and tomorrow will be my final ceremony of 17. I've been listening to you since before you had an actual podcast. It was actually your first podcast where you came onto Trussell's, where I found you. But since then, I've been with you in Oregon, in Chiang Mai, in Topanga, in Holland, and of course in the van. And you've been with me in Prague, and in Buenos Aires, on trains in Stockholm, and trails in Washington State, and buses across Paraguay, and on my flight here. I'm super grateful to have you and all of the Tangentially Speaking community with me on my various journeys. But until now, I've always been afraid to send you an intro. I was always afraid you'd recognize my name or my voice, because 4 years ago, you generously agreed to let me interview you for this article that I was writing about psychedelic medicine and podcasts. And at that point, I'd barely written any articles or had any published. They were all music journalism. And even though I got great interviews from you and Duncan and Daniele Bolelli and others, I did lots of research. No editor wanted to take a chance on it. I've always viewed that experience as a failure. When I interviewed you at this cafe in Topanga, we talked about podcasts and psychedelics, but we didn't talk about the fact that at the time I was pretty sick. I was sick with this physical problem that, at the point we spoke, had already kept me stuck in Los Angeles and away from being on the road where I belong, where so many of us tangentially speakers belong. I always felt pretty guilty for wasting your time after you were so generous with it, and pretty ashamed about not ever finishing that article or getting it published. Like I said, it looked like a big failure in my life. But it was while researching that article that never made it that I found that I ever first even thought of using ayahuasca as a treatment for myself, for the thing that I was dealing with. I ended up going to this center 3 years ago, and it fixed this physical problem that no doctors in Los Angeles could. I went to probably 9 of them. So I just wanted to say, for anyone else in our community that needs to hear it right now, that article that I've always seen as a failure, it saved my life in more ways than one. And that's what happened the first time I came to this place. And after, lots of shit in my life got way better, and then it got way worse. I ended up with more physical problems, more mental problems, but I found my way back here. And now that first failure that led me here, it didn't just save my life, it's given me the tools to build a new one, or to at least start. So I wanted to thank you for that, and for everything that you've given me over the years. I love you, man. And I love all of you guys.
Well, that made my fucking day. Ben, thank you so much for that. Of course, there was no need to worry about it, man. Honestly, I can't tell you how many documentary filmmakers I have sat in front of and combed my hair and washed my face and put on a nice shirt and sat there for 2-3 hours interviews, and the film never comes out. Never hear from them again. Lots of articles. I remember the Sun magazine, shortly after Sex at Dawn came out, sent this journalist to interview me. And it was going to be a huge article. It was, the dude probably spent 3 days hanging around, and he came to where I was at my parents' house in LA, and we must have spent 7-8 hours talking, and he's taking all these notes, and he wrote everything up, and he showed it all to me, and then the magazine spiked it. They killed it, and he was heartbroken. I felt really bad for the guy, as I should have, because, he got paid a kill fee, but he didn't get paid what he was supposed to be paid. I don't know if I was not interesting enough, or they decided the story was too provocative, or what, but he was a really good writer and great interviewer. Anyway, my point is that it's not a waste of time if you spend an hour or two talking with somebody who's interesting and sincere, and you clearly are, and I'm sure you were, although I don't remember that particular afternoon. And it's amazing how we find light in darkness so often. I don't want to start throwing around too many cliches here, but it really is amazing how you never know what doors are going to open for you. You never know what lies on the other side of the next step you're about to take. In my own personal experience, probably one of the more emblematic, symbolic situations like that was when I got robbed that first night in Barcelona. And then while I was waiting for my papers to come through and, whatever it was that I needed before I continued my journey, I met my old friend Marcos. And Marcos decided to show me around and introduce me to people. And next thing you know, someone offered me a job and a place to stay. And I met some women who seemed pretty interesting. And I was like, well, maybe I'll stick around Barcelona for a few months, see how this thing pans out. Because aside from robbing me, the city seems to be opening its arms to me and inviting me to stay a while. So I did. And 20 years later, that was the city I have spent the most amount of time in my entire life. Who the fuck knows is my point. Nobody. This episode is with a really special person. Her name is TRACY CLARK-FLORY. I first met Tracy after Sex at Dawn came out. I guess she had written an article about the book, or she called me and interviewed me or something. At the time, she was the sex writer for Salon.com. And, back in 2011, 2012, somewhere in there, Salon was a website that I frequented. They were doing some really interesting things. They had a lot of smart writers on staff. The editorial focus was edgy and interesting and smart and really substantial. I'm sorry to say that at this point I really don't look at Salon anymore. It seems to have been taken over by shouty, scoldy, cancel culture dipshits. But back in the day, it was interesting. Salon and Slate were the two journalism websites that I read in those days. And Slate at this point, it's like just fucking nonsense. It's strange to watch these things peak and then collapse so quickly. But anyway, I really liked Tracy. I liked her questions. I think we talked on the phone. I don't know. But then when I started the podcast, she was one of the first people I interviewed. I think she's episode 6 or something. If you go in the archives, definitely one of the first 10 episodes. And So let's see, when would that have been? I think I started the podcast about 8 years ago, 2012, 13, something like that. And yeah, so she was living in San Francisco in the Mission District. And I remember we recorded at her apartment. And I thought she was interesting. I remember there was, we talked about Neil Strauss at the time. Because I had just met him, I think, and she mentioned something about the game and how she had gone out with a dude who had a copy of the game on his like bedside table or something. And anyway, all this is to say, I met her. I did the podcast with her. I really liked her, and now she's written a memoir about those years, including those years. And having read the memoir, I know her so much better. I have such a more detailed and intimate understanding of what was going on in her life than I did sitting across that table from her in the room with her. The book is called Want Me, and I cannot recommend this book enough. You'll hear me telling Tracy how moved I am by the book, how impressed I am by her writing, and I was not blowing smoke up her ass. This is a really brave, beautiful piece of work by a brave and beautiful woman. And when I say beautiful, you'll understand I'm not talking about surface beauty. I'm talking about someone who not only feels things in such detail and at such depth, but has the language to express it and the courage to share it. I recommend this book to everybody. If you're a woman, you will find a kindred sister in that book who says things that you may have thought or felt, but were afraid to say out loud. If you're a man, you will gain insights into the experience of women, in particular this woman, that you would not have been able to gain any other way. I've had very intimate relationships with women over the years, and I've been blessed to have them confide in me and share things with me, and have very intimate conversations. And that's what this book feels like. It feels like someone who trusts you so much that she's willing to really let you know what it's like to be her. Fascinating book. Very much about her sexuality, her sort of learning to be a woman, her understanding of her own desires in the context of male desire, or at least what she imagines to be male desire, and just trying to find her way through the hall of mirrors that is sexuality in the 21st century America. It's fascinating. Really, I can't recommend it enough. Want Me by TRACY CLARK-FLORY. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I do want to play you out with a song that feeds into this theme of finding light in darkness, which is a theme that runs through Tracy's book, and certainly a theme that was introduced by Ben in that initial intro there about failure and success and healing and desperation and community and solitude and all those things. I saw a video a while ago. I was just rooting around on YouTube, as I tend to do sometimes, and this video came up, and it was by a guy named Sherman Kelly. It was a YouTube video, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. But, if you don't happen to go there, just look up a video on YouTube of Sherman Kelly. He is the man who wrote this song that I'm about to play you. This is a song that was very popular back in the day, in the 70s, I guess. He wrote the song in 1969, and it became, it was released in 1970, and by a band called King Harvest. And it was one of these one-hit wonders. I don't know if they ever had another hit, but this was a big hit. The song is called Dancing in the Moonlight. And you've heard the song if you ever listen to classic rock radio. It was released in 1972. It hit number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. So it was a big, presence on the radio. And this song was just, my whole life, this song has been just the sort of expression of cool, of just how happy and easy life can be. Dancing in the moonlight. Everybody's feeling all right. It's such a fine and natural sight. Everybody dancing in the moonlight. I saw this video, and he's talking about the origins of the song. And the origin of the song is that in 1969, he was on a trip to St. Croix, and he and his friends were on a sailboat. And that night, the water was kind of choppy, and his girlfriend felt like she would be sick if they slept on the boat. So they said, okay, let's just take the dinghy in and we'll sleep on the beach. So he and his girlfriend went, and they fell asleep on the beach. Beautiful, under the stars. He woke up being beaten by a gang who eventually murdered 8 American tourists. They beat him and his girlfriend, broke his face, multiple facial fractures, and raped her. And he was unconscious. Somehow he came to consciousness, saw what was happening, and just charged them. He must have looked like a monster with his face broken and blood everywhere and teeth falling out. And I guess he was grotesque enough that he scared them, and they ran away. In the video, he says that his girlfriend was okay. She recovered, had a good life. He had multiple surgeries on his face. And he was recovering at his friend's house in Ithaca, New York, a place I've spent a fair bit of time at. And he was so full of anger and despair and sadness and regret. And to keep his shit together, he kind of tried to fantasize about an alternative reality where peace and joy and celebration of life was what was happening. And people loved each other and took care of each other, just the opposite of what he had experienced. He and his girlfriend had experienced on St. Croix. And he sat down at his friend's piano, and this song came out of him. Dancing in the Moonlight, King Harvest, written by Sherman Kelly. All right. I am here with TRACY CLARK-FLORY, who I believe, I don't remember exactly which episode it was, but I think you were one of the first 10 episodes of this podcast that I recorded way back in 1846. It's amazing. I remember Sex at Dawn had just come out, I think, or you wrote a review or something in Salon. Is that how we met each other?
That sounds about right. Yeah, it was it feels like a long time ago.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
I mean, I think I've done this podcast for about 8 years or so. And so You were right there at the beginning. This I just uploaded episode 450 something.
Oh my, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And that's just 450 different people for the most part that you've talked to, I would imagine. Not repeat appearances. That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah.
Jeez.
It's been great. I had no idea it was going to like become my central focus. But thanks to people like you, it got off the ground and it's still flying. So thanks for coming back.
So great. Yeah, I'm happy to.
A few things have changed in your life.
Yes, I wrote a book. I had a baby. those are the main things that have happened in the intervening years.
I've written 2 books, and I often compare writing a book to having a baby, but I've never had a baby. So maybe you can flesh out that comparison a little. Is that a valid?
I think it's an apt comparison. I think that the many months of gestation, I think it takes longer to gestate a book, I would say. On average, it depends. Some people are quick. But yeah, and then this sense of like sending this thing that you've created off into the world.
Right.
And letting go is, I think there's a definite comparison.
Yeah, the sequence of like extreme attention and care followed
Intimacy.
by surrender.
Yeah. Surrender and separation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the wildest thing about writing a book is like, for me at least, it was like this intense immersion in the project and just like sitting with it in this very private way and then opening it up to the world to consume and have opinions about and react to. And yeah, what an experience.
And in your case, it's particularly intimate because what you wrote about was so intimate. So confession time for me. I'm recording 5 or 6 episodes a week right now because I'm about to go spend the summer in my van. So I'm sucking up all the Wi-Fi connectivity I have here in the last couple of months. So I'm interviewing a lot of authors, and I'm not reading their books. There's no way I'm going to read 5 or 6 books a week. And so last night, you sent me a copy of your book, and I had it on my desktop, and I forgot to look at it. And I looked at my calendar last night, and I was like, oh, my God, I'm talking to Tracy tomorrow morning. Oh, shit. And I opened the PDF, and I thought, well, I'll just sort of scan it and get a general sense. And I started reading at the beginning, and I finally went to bed at 1 a.m. because I had to do this with you, and I wanted to get enough sleep, but I read half the book,
Nice.
So I'm not going to lie and pretend I read the whole book, but I am going to say that I read enough of it to know that I'm going to read the rest, and it's beautiful. It's really beautifully.
Thank you.
And you are a really, really good writer. And there's something about...
Thank you so much.
And there's something about the combination of just really good writing, just the way you shape language and your humor and the surprising twists and the accuracy of your memory. I'm assuming it's accurate. I don't care if it's accurate. It seems accurate, which is the most important thing.
Feels accurate.
And the excerpts from like text messages that you were sending back and forth with, some guy you were seeing, and excerpts from your journal and conversations with your parents, and like your attention to detail just makes it so engaging. And then you combine that with the real courage that it takes to write about your intimacy, your sexual awakening, your relationships with your parents, you're talking about things that a lot of people would never say out loud, and you're saying them not only out loud, but in a stadium full of strangers.
Right. Well, thank you for that. But yeah, I mean, it's so funny sitting down at your computer and writing a book like this. And of course, that it's going to be published. Like that, the aim is to share this with other people. But there's definitely a gap there where, And for me, that gap was closed when I recorded the audio for the book. And I went and I actually sat in a studio with two strangers, a director and a sound engineer, and read my book aloud to them over the course of a week. And like that was when it really hit me that other people were going to be consuming this, the intimacy of being in the sound booth where they can like hear every little sound, and then just that's when it, and that was kind of terrifying to really face the reality of how much I would be giving this up and over to other people, and then it would in some ways not be mine anymore.
Yeah.
That it would be out there in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something about telling a story about ourselves that sort of externalizes something that until we tell the story was totally internal.
Yeah. Well, and I've had the experience of like very good friends of mine who have read the book and have learned things about me that they just didn't know because it's just never come up in conversation. Mm-hmm. So it's just the sort of level of intimacy with a memoir it's just kind of unparalleled, and it's because these are people that I've had great intimacy with. I've shared all sorts of, aspects of myself with these people, and yet there are just things that don't come up in day-to-day conversation and friendship that you reveal in a memoir. And so it's an interesting new form of intimacy to experience with strangers and friends alike.
Did you find any sort of increased intimacy with yourself as you were writing? Yeah.
There was obviously so much self-reflection. And there was the digging through, like you mentioned, I had this AOL Instant Messenger conversation with my high school boyfriend that I'd actually printed out at the time and preserved in my journal, which was how I could include it in the book all these decades later. And so revisiting that stuff, like I think especially revisiting all of these artifacts from high school and even from my early 20s, there was this sense of intimacy with myself and a sort of like a revisiting with that younger self. And sort of experiencing compassion for her from this more adult removed distance where I'm in a very different place in my life. I'm married, I have a kid, and so that is a really bizarre experience to kind of to feel like you're communing with like an earlier version of yourself. So yeah, definitely.
Do you think you'll ever be as far away from your current self as you are now from her?
Right. Yeah, you have to wonder, because I know that as a younger person, I definitely thought that, when I was in middle school, high school, I thought like I'll arrive at the age of, 25 or 30 and I'll be an adult and I'll have it all figured out. And, it's really easy to look down the line and imagine that, you arrive at some sort of stable, consistent adult place. And so far, that has not been my experience. And so my expectation is that things will continue shifting and changing, and that I'll continue surprising myself over the course of my life. So
how old are you?
Probably. I'm 37 now.
Okay. I just turned 59, and I don't know if this will be good news or bad news to you, but I feel like there is an arrival. Like there is a point you get to where you sort of, move into the house you're going to grow old in. And then you just rearrange furniture and maybe, make an addition or, fix the roof. But that's your house. You're you now, and you just get older. But you're just an older version of you. Whereas between, 16 to 28, it's like, no, that's a whole different person. Like you can see you can see things, the acorns that later become oaks, but they're not trees yet. They're definitely,
Right.
yeah, it's
Right.
It's interesting. I reading your book last night, I was reminded of, I don't remember who said this, but some writer said you should always write posthumously. Always write as if you're dead. You know?
Yeah.
And
Right.
because sometimes I think about trying to write a memoir, and that would be the only, that would be like the main reason I would be interested in doing it, is to see how revealing I can be. Like, how honest can I be?
Right.
And that feels almost like a Zen exercise or something, you know, an exercise in nakedness and shamelessness. And, you know, did you feel that? Were you doing some sort of a spiritual discipline as you were writing?
I mean, when you say shamelessness, that really resonates for me, because I think that's for a long time has been something I've aspired toward and have never achieved. I've never actually achieved a state of shamelessness and having, you know, no relationship to shame. Of course not. Is that possible? I don't know. But reaching for that has long been sort of a value of mine. And I value so much that kind of naked, honest, you know, revealing writing, because I know how much it means for me and how much it can mean for readers. I mean, I've had that experience of encountering people who are willing to put it all on the page, and what that meant for me in terms of just the validation in finding someone who's sharing similar thoughts and experiences that you thought were only your own, and all of that. So there was definitely, in the writing process, there was that I think I had to delude myself to a certain degree, and hold that value of shamelessness, and to write as honestly as I could without thinking about how will this be perceived? What will it be like to go, you know, get together with my family for Thanksgiving after everyone's read the book?
Yeah.
Which is, you know, and now I have to face that. So like, I feel like the self who wrote the book has now delivered this sort of dilemma for my current self, which is like, okay, well, everyone's read the book, it's out there, and you have to sort of deal with incorporating that into your life. That, you know, because in a lot of ways it doesn't feel so scary in the abstract, revealing it to an anonymous reader, but it's more so a lot of the stuff that's in the book, you don't share that level of detail and intimacy with family members. Right. With friends, sure. Even. And so, you know, there is something very bizarre about incorporating that.
And a lot of the story, at least in the beginning chapters, is sort of about how you were not as intimate with people as you were pretending to be. So it's interesting now, there's this sort of, I don't know what the word for it is. There's like a balance to it. There's, you know, here you are being incredibly intimate with strangers about the fact that it was difficult for you to be intimate with lovers, you know, and with yourself in some ways. Is there a healing process in all of this? Is there like a therapeutic value to this?
Yeah, there is. And, you know, that was pretty unexpected. Like, I feel, I mean, I don't know how to say this in a way that's not totally corny, but I feel there is this sort of liberating aspect to it where I feel like I put it all on the table. It's all out there. I've sort of confronted, you know, I think all along in the book, I have this fear of intimacy, of revealing myself, of, you know, in a lot of cases, especially in the realm of sex, of like being too much or too much to handle, or, and so I think like sort of coming out in this way with this book feels, I feel very released from all of that, you know? And so I feel fully incorporated in the sense that like, there isn't, this part of myself that I'm hiding or concealing or need to sort of protect. It feels like it's all out there.
Yeah. How did you negotiate the opposing appetite for revelation and this sort of search for shamelessness and discretion? I mean, you're married, you have a child, you know, there are certain things about your parents that maybe you were tempted to share but felt, well, is this really fair to them, you know?
Right.
How do you work through that stuff? Did you talk with your husband about it as you were writing, or did you just write it all and say, read it and tell me what you think? Or is it like,
deal with it?
I'm a writer, you know, you knew that going in? Or like, how do you do that?
You knew what you were getting into. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my husband, like he's the person he understood this book from the start better than anyone. I have not talked to anyone more about this book, like from the earliest days of the idea. And so he's so intimately familiar with all of the themes and, you know, the whole arc of the book, and has like been the strongest champion of it. And so for that, I feel really lucky. You know, I actually met him we worked together at Salon. And so he knew very much like what my whole deal was when he got into the relationship.
I'm dating a sex columnist.
Right. Which he had apprehensions about, but he knew, and you know, is fine with it. And so there wasn't a lot of negotiation. He's pretty comfortable even with me, you know, revealing stuff as it relates to him. But I had my own sort of sense of, it's interesting, like what I came up against where I felt like, nope, that's a hard boundary. The reader doesn't get to see that. And that was with my son. I don't name my son in the book. And it's just, I couldn't even bring myself to use an initial. Like it just felt like that was one just hard boundary for me where I felt so protective of my kid, where I talk about him. I talk about sort of but it's more so my experience stepping into motherhood.
Right.
But my child, so off limits and so deserving of his own story in this way that like I feel fiercely protective. And so that was like one interesting area where, you know, so much else feels totally game, you know, and up for grabs, but not that. And then luckily, like my dad is remarkably okay with me writing about like finding his porn as a teenager, and you know, like there was no. I showed him all of the sections in the book that featured him before it published, and gave him an opportunity to speak up if anything was, you know, cross boundaries for him, and it didn't. So, you know, luckily. I guess my family is pretty supportive and pretty okay with being featured in the book. So far. I mean, right.
You haven't had that first Thanksgiving dinner yet, post-publication.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I know, you know, some folks have told me already that it was challenging to read the book, or that, you know, they felt like it was too much information and they had to kind of put it down, and it took them a while to get through it. So, you know, I think it's challenging for some folks to read.
Yeah, I shortly after, you know, in the experience of having published Sex at Dawn, I became surprisingly relaxed about my friends and family not reading it. Like it was almost like, you know, I'm still this way. It's like you read a book when it's the right time to read it. And if you force it,
True.
That's not good for anyone. You shouldn't read it out of obligation to me. You don't need to pretend you've read it if you haven't. It's cool, Lots of people.
Yeah.
It's not like this isn't a personal thing, as you said. You send it out into the world, and it has its own life out there. You mentioned your son. Did you? Well, I know you did. So let me just say, what was it like as you were writing and you imagine your son 20 years from now sitting down and reading about Mom? I don't know. The level of detail and intimacy in this book is way, way, way more than I know about my mother's sexual awakening, assuming she's ever awakened. I mean, it could be happening now for all I know. What was that like? Because in a way, you're protecting his autonomy, and yet by saying this, you are taking a part of his life and making it public, even though you never name him, right? His mom is a big part of his life. Yeah.
I mean, there's no protecting him from that. There's no protecting him from the fact that I've written this book, that there are like approximately 20 copies of this book in our house, that he knows, he recognizes the cover. He's 3.5 now. So he sees the cover and he can say, oh, that's Mama's book, So he has already a relationship to it. Obviously, he's not able to read it, and probably will, I don't know if he'll ever read it, for one. I have author friends who've written books in the realm of sex that are not personal, and even then they're like teenagers are like, oh God, I don't want to read your book, Mom.
Exactly.
I refuse to read your book. And so I would imagine that would probably be his relationship to that book. And, I think it's something that I will be open with him about. I'll be open with what the book is about. And I will also, past a certain age, it's up to him whether he would want to read it. I don't know that I think if I was talking about my mom, I think probably I would have reached a point in my 20s where I might have been ready to read that kind of book from my mom. But, it's I've definitely thought about what does it mean for a boy to grow up with a mom who is out there in this way publicly. It's easy to worry about. It's easy to oh God, what if his middle school friends discover his mom's writing on the internet and sort of, bring it to school or whatever. But mostly I try to focus on the positive, which is that, I'm really eager to have the kind of relationship with my kid, over the course of his childhood and teenage years where we can talk openly about sex in a healthy and age-appropriate way, and that I can try to sort of correct some of the omissions that, from my childhood growing up with my parents. And, I think hopefully that's a positive to have two parents really who are comfortable with the subject matter.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I get a lot of people who send me, who want to come on the podcast because they've written a book, a memoir in their 30s or 20s even sometimes. And it's always a very difficult thing for me because, like you, I sort of always thought of myself as a writer. And when I was in my 20s and 30s, I was traveling around, backpacking around the world. And lots of times people would say, oh, you should write a book, man. That's a great story. You should write a book. And I was tempted to, but I never did. And the reason I never did was partly just sort of a self-protective habit of laziness, I think. But that was combined with sort of an instinctive sense that it would be a bad move because I would be doing it out of ego. that my reason for writing the book would be, look how good I can write. Look, because I wanted the attention, or I thought I was going to get famous, or, whatever it was. And so I always, my answer was like, look, just because you're tall doesn't mean you should play basketball. Just because you're a good writer doesn't mean you should write. And I get these people now sending me their memoirs, and I don't know how to respond to them, because what I want to say to them is like, hey, it's cool that you're writing. That's good. And it's good to practice and all that. But I don't really give a shit about a memoir from someone who's 32 years old. Like, go live your fucking life and then write a memoir. Go, it's like backpacking in Peru that's not a reason to write a book. So This is all a very long-winded way of saying, I didn't feel that at all reading yours. I didn't feel that there was any kind of like ego drive in it. And I guess that's because of how ruthless you were. That you know what I mean? You don't reveal, things about yourself that are really hard to say if you're writing out of ego. So, so you pulled it off. Right. You are a young person who wrote a memoir who isn't writing out of ego, at least as far as I can tell.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that it at least seems that way. I mean, I think that there is something to that, in that there's a lot in this book that I do not feel good about.
Yeah.
I don't feel like, there are many moments in this book where I'm embarrassed by it. I'm horrified. And speaking of shame, there's like the shame that came up when writing, scenes in the book where I am, and it has nothing to do with sex really. It's not sexual shame, but it's shame around, like the ignorance of my early 20s and that sort of thing, where, certainly I would not write those scenes if it was coming from a place of like wanting to look good.
Right.
Or wanting to come off as though I've always had it figured out. And actually I set out to write this book and did not think I was writing a memoir initially, and was like horrified at the realization that I was writing a memoir.
Really?
I found that so embarrassing. What an embarrassing thing to be writing a memoir.
At 35 or whatever you were.
Jesus, give me a break.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it was like, like had all the eye rolls for that idea. But it just was like, it was so obviously the book that I was writing. Like, I thought I was writing a book about straight men's desire, and then it became so clear that I was like a journalistic book, and then it became so clear that it was about me and my relationship in many ways to men's desire. And there just was no escaping the reality of where the excitement was for me, it was, and where I had like all the energy and heat. It was actually about me and my relationship to men and to male desire and to sex. And I just, I had to admit it. It's a memoir. Deal with it. That's
interesting. I was going to ask you about the moment of conception of the book. Like, did you wake up in the middle of the night saying, okay, I'm going to write a memoir? But it sounds like you were doing something totally different, and it insisted on being a memoir. That's interesting. It insisted.
Yeah. Basically what happened with the book was I was laid off from my job while 8 months pregnant. And I'd been wanting to write this book, theoretically, for a long time. And then that was just sort of this opportunity where I was about to have a baby and, you have a maternity leave. And okay, time to work on a book proposal. And that's when I started digging into it and realized that, it was not a book about male desire. It was a memoir.
And yet still about male desire largely, because so much of your own sexual awakening seems to be, and I think you say this explicitly in the book, sort of figuring out what men want and then shaping yourself around that somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, is there, did I experience the opposite of that, or the you know, the mirror image of that? Because when I was young, I was very very interested in women's sexuality, how it works. I mean, I've told this story on the podcast before. When I was 15 years old, I had a lockbox. I remember I bought it at a stationary supply kind of place, you know, and it was one of those boxes that was fireproof, and you could like put your important documents in it and stuff, and it had a key lock. And that's where I kept all the sex toys that I had. I had vibrators and French ticklers and ribbed condoms and anal beads and, you know, whatever I could get my hands on. And this was the, you know, late 70s. So it wasn't like you could just go on Amazon and order all this stuff.
Right.
Because my first girlfriend, my first sexual relationship, like, she would have orgasms when I went down on her, but she didn't have orgasms when we fucked. And so I was like, okay, I wasn't threatened by it at all. I was just like, how does this work? Like, you know, and I'd read, you know, the clitoris is here and the G-spot's here. And like, do you have a G-spot? Like, let's find it. So it was, for me, it was like a science experiment. And luckily she was chill, and she's like, all right, you know, explore. I don't care. And so I was very interested. And then later I realized, or at least I came to the conclusion, that women's sexual response really isn't about their bodies so much. It's about their minds. It's getting into their fantasy life, and, you know, the forbidden areas, and creating a space where a woman feels free to tell you what really works for her, or what she imagines when she comes, when she's alone. And like, that's where you find a woman. So I don't know, this isn't really a question, I guess, but I'm sort of like, is male, because the way you describe male sexual desire, it's pretty simple. Like, you say at one point, like, you go to these porn sites, and it's like, okay, this is what men want. This is it. Fantasy is just an expression of hunger, and these are the shapes of male hunger. Is there an equivalent with women? Is there female desire per se?
I mean, God, well, first of all, like, the perception that I took to porn sites, like tube sites especially, where, you know, I had this very literal interpretation. Like, okay, this video is the most viewed and top rated video on UJizz, which was like the tube site of the time. So
still exists, by the way. I was reading last night, I was like, UJizz, never heard of that. I went and looked at it. It's still there. Is that a real site?
It really sounds like something someone would, a name someone would make up to, but yeah, I mean, I interpreted the top video on that site as like, this is what men want. This must be, because it's what everyone's liking and watching. And so I had, you know, no sort of nuanced understanding of fantasy and how fantasy works, right? And just had this very literal interpretation of fantasy, which I don't think that fantasy can be interpreted very literally. I mean, rarely can it be. Oftentimes fantasies have like the opposite meaning that they seem to have. Like, it's just this really complex realm that I was so ill-equipped to, you know, interpret. And yeah, I think I had a very simplistic idea of quote unquote straight male desire. You know, there is no straight male desire. There is just, you know, desire, like a multitude of desires, you know, but I aspired to this idea that, like, and that we're sold, of course, that men's desire can be very easily categorized and sort of labeled, and that it's simplistic and, you know, one-dimensional and unemotional, and, you know, all of these things that certainly, like, working as a journalist writing about sex, that definitely corrected a lot of those misconceptions. But in terms of there being an equivalent for women's desire, I mean, I think, you know, really what we're talking about are like, what are the sort of like mainstream representations of desire? Like, how do we interpret desire? Because I don't think that tube sites are an accurate reflection of male desire. They're an accurate reflection of one aspect, right, of fantasy. And so I don't know what the equivalent would be for women. I mean, I just finished writing an article about men on TikTok who are making videos like what I called romantic thirst traps specifically for straight women. And they're really working with these like very, you know, tired stereotypes of what women want around like this sort of juxtaposition of like strength and softness. So you have, you know, men who are like cooking and doing the dishes, but are also chopping wood. And like, you know, it's very reminiscent of that joke book that came out, I think in 2007 called Porn for Women, which was just all like photos of shirtless hunks, like vacuuming. Which I always found like such an insulting representation.
To whom?
Of female desire.
Oh, to women, okay.
Insulting to women. I mean, and probably also to men. Probably everyone's insulted by that, really. But, so yeah, I think, I mean, the main thing I think I learned on my journey as a sex writer is that we are all sold these really inaccurate and simplistic notions of male and female desire. And the irony for me was that I ended up married to a man who kind of went on a very similar trajectory as I did, where he was focused on what do women want? How can I not be the stereotypical jackhammering brute was what he once said to me. And so he was like, you know, he read like the whole lesbian sex book and She Comes First. And like, you know, he studied up and sort of did he was on his own sort of parallel track of trying to understand female desire. And both of us brought a lot of misconceptions to our journeys and then happened to, you know, sort of meet. And so there was something kind of poetic in the ways that we'd really sort of studied up to be what the opposite sex wanted. But what I found in him was that he didn't, like, none of those simplistic notions of male sexuality applied to him. And so like all of the studying that I'd done like went out the window, basically. It did not apply.
Interesting. There was a moment when you mentioned it earlier where you find your dad's porn and, you know, you had a bit of a crisis. You were a little disappointed that he was attracted to the women that you saw on those websites or whatever. And I felt at that moment like, as a man, I wanted to like reach through the book and say to you at 15 or whatever you were, like there's no reason to be disappointed in your dad. Like, your dad does believe what he said to you, that beauty is internal and intelligence is the most beautiful thing and kindness, and like he believes those things, but he also like, you know, a blonde in high heels with big tits is hot too. Like, there's no conflict there. And I understood how the little girl was like, he was lying all the time. And I just wanted to, you know, sort of say it's not that simple, you know. Obviously that was your point. But I do feel like culturally this inability to appreciate nuance in sexual appetite is just pernicious and corrosive. Yeah,
I agree so much. I mean, I think like cultural illiteracy around fantasy to me is like that it's huge. It's huge because that's why in that moment I was so unprepared to be able to hold that like all of those messages, those feminist, you know, messages around what he valued in women, that was all true. it was also true that he subscribed to perfect10.com, you know? And, you know, it took me a while to begin to sort of incorporate those. And I think that part of how I began to incorporate it was that under the guise of trying to figure out straight male desire, you know, looked at porn and, you know, poked around on tube sites, and in the process discovered my own relationship to fantasy. And that's where the whole thing cracked open for me, because it was like, oh, I have this capacity to be contradictory, you know, in terms of my beliefs and my fantasies. And that was what really introduced me to just what fantasy can mean, and how we can have those tensions within ourselves. But it was really like, you know, I kind of had to it's not that I didn't want to figure out straight male desire. I think there was that was an earnest pursuit, but I also think it functioned as a cover story that allowed me to pursue my own desires. Right. You know, it was like, oh, I'm not a pervert. I'm not looking at porn for my own interests. I'm just looking at it to figure men out. But, you know, in the process faced the reality of my own interests there. And, that was educational. But, you know, I had to like educate myself in terms of the nuances of fantasy. That was certainly not anything that was ever discussed in school. Sex ed. Never touched on.
Would you love to teach that
even
class?
Remotely.
Wow.
Oh, I mean, can you imagine if they would actually allow that to happen? Yeah. That would be,
yeah.
So needed, but.
You know, I when I was writing Sex at Dawn, I realized something about myself, came to understand something about myself, which is that I've always found desire and sexuality to be intellectually really, really interesting. And I also find ideas to be erotically stimulating. Mm-hmm. I literally get off on a really interesting idea, or a really smart person, or a really well-written paragraph, or an insight. Like, an insight makes my dick hard. It's a weird, I don't know if it's a short circuit or what it is.
That's a cool sort of talent, I suppose.
Well, I suspect you share it. I mean, not the dick part, but you're right. I feel like reading you and knowing you a little bit, like you experience sex intellectually, and I imagine you experience intellect erotically as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a charge there that's kind of hard to explain. And I think, who is it that wrote really beautifully about just the way that, was it Audre Lorde, about the ways that the erotic sort of, seeps into all areas of our life, right? And that you can have that kind of, that there can be an erotic aspect to, intellectual pursuits, to your work, in this way that is hard to describe and really pin down. But, it's just that excitement and that feeling of desire, and that, there is just arousal that, in the broadest sense of the term, like that spark is definitely there when talking intellectually about sex, as well as, any other topic.
Well, there's revelation, right? There's nakedness. There's, risking rejection. There's so many commonalities. Have you ever thought of yourself? I know you've interviewed a lot of sex workers. There are scenes where you're on this porn site, and your column at Salon, you were doing all sorts of stuff, reviewing sex toys, and you're doing all that stuff. Have you ever thought of yourself as a sex worker?
No, I haven't.
Someone who reads this book will know more about you and your eroticism than someone who watches a porn star having sex.
It's certainly, yeah, it's way more revealing. Yeah, it's way more revealing because I'm not revealing my, sort of body in performance. I'm revealing myself.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Which is, it's just, that is, yeah. It is incredibly revealing. Yeah, it is incredibly revealing. And it's certainly not done with, it's not done with the intent of arousal. I think it's in fact like pretty unarousing. Like I think it's in a lot of ways it's a very unsexy sex book, but yeah, certainly in terms of sex work, like I talk a bit about this in the book, like I don't, while my name is attached to the articles that I've written forevermore on the internet, I don't suffer any, not even a fraction of the stigma that's attached to sex work. So no, I don't think that no. Yeah.
When I say that, I was thinking of the scene where you're in a strip club and getting a lap dance. And I was thinking about, I've had lots of porn stars on this podcast. And I was thinking, like Angela White, for example, I had on the podcast. She's huge, number one porn star in the world probably right now.
Yeah.
And she's super, super smart. I don't know if you've ever met her.
Yeah.
Like she has a master's
I have. Yeah.
in sexology.
Yeah, she's fascinating.
Yeah, I think she's awesome. And I was just thinking like, how reading your book is like, I know more about your sexuality than I know about hers, even though I've seen her like in gangbangs and,
right.
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't mean, I wasn't, I didn't mean to diminish the stigma attached to that work and the courage that those people have.
Yeah.
But there's something like, I can imagine her saying, oh my God, it's no problem for me to like be in a, 10-on-1 gangbang on camera, but I could never write the kind of book that TRACY Clark-FLORY wrote. I could never be that revealing.
Right.
And I think a fair bit of her motivation for what she does is destigmatizing it and, taking away the shame to some extent.
Yeah.
What was, now it's confusing a little bit because I wanted to ask you why you wrote this book. And I'm anticipating, I wanted to help young girls not get hung up the way I did and so on. But then you told the story that you didn't actually set out to write this book. Right. So did you ever consider not putting your name on it? Using it, writing under a pseudonym?
No. One, even just practically, like, I don't know that my publisher would have published it, like, I think there's a lot to be said for that you have a name behind it because, but why did I want to write it? I think it's really hard to put to words. I obviously did have this initial other idea that was more journalistic, and I felt this need and this hunger to write it. And I think in a lot of ways I was still trying to sort some stuff out. Like there was a story that I needed to tell, and I was trying to figure out what that story was. And I just felt the pull to the page to start doing that. And it was in that process that I, turned to memoir. And of course I could tell you exactly as you've anticipated, like why I wanted to write the book, to help young women and all of that, which is all very true in terms of like what I came up with as I was writing it and the sort of meaning that arose for me as the project shifted. But like on a deeper level, there was like a much more personal and probably just, selfish in that like I had my own desire to write the story down and to figure out like what was the arc, what was the story that I was really trying to tell. And so But a lot of the other sort of explanations definitely do come after the fact. But there is this like much harder to pin down hunger, right? You know, I don't even know how to describe it. That you know, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot easier to say, I want to help young women. And, you know, I wish I had a book like this when I was in my early 20s, and all of that is true. But I don't think that that's what made me write it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And also, like, let it be said that I think this book is also incredibly helpful for young men.
I mean, yes, I hope, I'm glad you said that, because my hope all along was like, this would not just be a book that young women read.
Yeah.
Like, I never wanted to write a book just for young women.
Well, young men are trying to figure out women, like what's going on in there.
Yeah.
It's hard to figure out sometimes. And so to have a woman, I have two very close friends who do a podcast together called Whore Rapport. They have a rapport, right? And they're sort of like, and their whole thing is like, look, they're your age roughly. And they're like, look, okay, the purpose of this is two women talking very openly about sex, about every aspect of our desire, our experiences, our shame, our fear, our regrets, everything. For women, but also for men, because, you know, like that's what we want. That's, you know, at least the smart men want to know, what are you really feeling?
Right.
Getting back to the question of male desire, because both of these women have told me that when in their sexual fantasies, they often are experiencing the fantasy from the man's perspective. So even when they're having sex, they're imagining what it's like to fuck them. You know what I mean?
Right.
Which makes me wonder if we're not getting caught up in a linguistic thicket when we call it male desire. Maybe what we're talking about is desire. Just that kind of animal hunger, which we attribute to men, but in my experience, women feel a hell of a lot of that too. Sometimes they frame it as they're projecting themselves into the male experience. Yeah, but aren't we just talking about hunger? Right.
I mean, I do think like we don't have a lot of models of that kind of women's hungry desire.
Yeah.
You know, especially in this sort of the realm of like, you know, being a sexual spectator and like, objectifying men, if you will. Like there are very few models of that, you know, but I just anecdotally from my own experience think that women are perfectly capable of that, and that there's, you know, no shortage of sort of capacity there. But I do think that, you know, I think that, well, for one, I think that women are, from a very young age, encouraged to tamp down their sexuality, to even channel their desire into being desired. You know, there are all these forces that really that facilitate that sort of subversion of desire, which is not to say that women don't, you know, authentically and genuinely take satisfaction from being desired, but that so often like the fullness of one's desire is channeled into this very narrow aspect of being desired, of making oneself desirable. And so that it's, I think that's like the most easily accessible route to sexual expression oftentimes for women, is that, you know, being desired and, you know, seeing oneself through the male gaze and all of that, like, is so readily accessible. Everyone has that experience of I think of satisfaction around being desired, of course, like, and being on the other end of that kind of hungry animal desire.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, though, to think about, if we only have a model of that kind of hungry animal desire coming from men, then must women then sort of, as your friends express, must they then experience that through the man's eyes rather than through their own eyes?
Right. Right. And I wonder to what extent that inhibits orgasm in a lot of women, because orgasm is a surrender to that animal, physiological reaction to something. And if you're feeling like, no, that's not my realm, that's his realm, then, I get my pleasure when he comes, then there's which is why fake orgasms are so offensive, because, from the man's perspective, ideally at least, just as a woman is getting off on being desired, the man is getting off on having provided this experience to the woman. It kind of closes the circuit, right? I really wanted to fuck you, and then you really enjoyed it, and now everything's complete, all the boxes are checked. And so there's this weird betrayal of faking it. It's like if if the guy was like, well, I wasn't really attracted to you, I just wanted to fuck you because I was bored. It's that kind of wait a minute. It's interesting when. Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, in terms of talking about the parts of the book that I have shame about, admitting to faking orgasms, epically and routinely through my 20s, that's one of those moments of shame, because there's just the aspect of betrayal and lying, that is, it's incredibly embarrassing to reveal that. And I do think that faking orgasms, at least in my case, it was about staying in control. Mm-hmm. It was very much about not being comfortable with surrender, and about really being in control of the perception of the sexual event and how it was going, and sort of managing the scene of it.
Very performative, and I understand that there's a desire to please that underlies all that, but it backfires, as so often does. I wanted to just read the epigraph to your book real quickly and talk about that a little bit. I was really struck by it. It's a quote from Miranda July. Is that Julie? July, I guess?
July, yeah.
She says, I'm always interested to hear how a woman conceives of herself as a sexual person, because there is really no map for this, only a series of contradictory and shaming warnings. So whatever any of us comes up with is going to be wholly unique and perhaps a little monstrous, like a creature that has survived multiple attacks, yet still walks, still desires. It's really, there's a lot in there.
I love that.
Yeah, there's so much in there.
There's a lot in there, yeah.
I mean, the word, conceives, first of all, I'm sure that's intentionally chosen. Really interesting how you essentially give birth to yourself in a way, right? And there's no map for this, only a series of contradictory and shaming warnings. It's so true. I often say if we taught kids about driving the way we teach them about sex, we would give them the keys, say, go figure it out, don't wreck the car, and I don't want to hear about it. How's that going to work out?
Yeah.
And the word monstrous is interesting too, because I think that resonates with what we were saying about the animalistic, nature of things. It's really interesting. And reading that, I thought that's so true for women, and I wonder to what extent it's true for men. And also generationally, I feel like there's so much more shame around male sexuality now in American society than there was when I was a kid. And I think that this lack of a map is an acute problem for young men as well. when I was a kid, it was like Hugh Hefner, Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson. Like there was this kind of like, cool, he's a womanizer, but he loves women. Like the whole thing about Warren Beatty was like, he's fucked everybody, but he loved all of them, right? And they all love him, and no one's got a bad thing to say about him, Like, that was kind of when I grew up, like, you love women by loving women. And now I feel like it's much more complicated, with the sort of shame around male desire, the sort of like all men are rapists thing from, you mentioned her, what's her name? Woman hating, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, and, that wave of man shaming feminism that came in when, just as I was sort of leaving college, and I guess has become much more prevalent. Your book, I guess the point I wanted to make is that your book serves as a map for men and women, I think, in a way. I remember when you and I did the first podcast, you're in the first 10 episodes and Neil Strauss is in the first 10 episodes.
Oh, that's great.
And he came up because he's become a friend of mine over the years, I have to admit. And I remember you saying somehow he came up, or maybe I saw the book in your apartment, because I remember we recorded in your apartment in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying like, like I dated a dude and I saw that book on his bookshelf. And and then I read that passage last night where you talk about the salsa dude and, how he negged you and all that shit.
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah. And he had a highlighted and, double underlined copy of his book, of his book and of Mystery's book.
Mystery. I did a thing recently. A lot of people have been telling me like, dude, you have to read this book, The Way of the Superior Man.
Oh, man. So I actually have been wanting to read that and write about it because I've been noticing that it's in Amazon's like top 10 gender studies books, or top 3 even for like at least, I don't know how many years now. Right. And so did you read it? You did? And what do you think?
And I did an entire podcast about it.
Oh, you did? Okay, I'm going to go listen to it.
I mean, the sort of quick version is the reason I mention it is that it's filling this need, and I think that our society, one of the many pathological aspects of our society is that we really don't offer guidance to young men and women and how to do this, how to be a good man, how to be a woman who's both desirable to men, but integrated within herself, like how do you do that? Sometimes they're contradictory impulses. How do you integrate them, and these books, The Game and the, that whole pickup artist thing, like that's trying to teach men how to deal with women. It's a very exploitative bullshit approach, I think, but there's a need, there's a hunger for it, I guess. There's a market.
Yeah. There is.
And so Daniel, the book is David or Data, Daniel, somebody.
Data, right.
Essentially, there's a lot of it that I like, because a lot of it is saying to men like, hey, be a man, figure out your shit before you start asking women to be involved in your life, right? So it's sort of a Jordan Peterson, clean your room, that message, which I think is true. And have a source of meaning in your life that isn't your relationship, right? What is your purpose in life? Figure that out. And then women will be attracted to you because you've got a good life. You're an integrated, interesting person. So that's great. I really agree with that.
Yeah.
The problem that I found in the book was his depiction of women, which I found to be extremely insulting and basically his thing is like, look, women lie all the time, but they're not really lying because their cognitive process is all about meaning. It's not about facts. So when a woman, says she hates you, don't take it seriously. She doesn't really hate you. She's just having a moment and it'll pass. It's a very sort of like patting the little lady on the head kind of a thing.
Right.
You know, and so my thing is like, no, if a woman tells me she hates me, either she hates me or she's so unstable I don't want to be around her. Right? Because if I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who hates me, you know, or says they do.
No.
So it's a very like, oh, women are children and you just sort of have to, you know, make allowances for their hormones and their silliness.
Right.
So,
yeah,
I don't know why the fuck I'm talking about that.
No, well, yeah, I mean, it relates to the pickup artist books in that I think there's a similar sort of approach to women, or an attitude towards women.
Right,
you know?
that they're targets
Yeah, and that they're like these simple creatures that, you know, if you just learn XYZ trick, like you can, you know, it just, but they are obviously like these best-selling books, like massively popular, are speaking to a desire. And I don't know that I don't think that they're satisfying it in a healthy way, but like the desire is there. That need is there.
And when you're feeling totally lost, even a bad map feels helpful, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
And if you're that lost, you don't know it's a bad map, right? You don't realize it. So,
well, honestly, when I think about the salsa dancing lawyer who picked me up while using the game, you know, I don't think he was or is a bad guy, and I think he was pretty lost and looking for rules, and that there was insecurity there, and that he, you know, clung to those rules, and I can empathize with that totally. I see all of the ways in which I was doing a similar version of that, right? Like I was like, you know, in that period of my life, I was like, oh, pickup artists, like I hate them. All these guys coming up to me and using lines that I recognize from the game, like give me a break. But there was a way in which I was doing the flip of that with men, in that I was also trying to sort of maintain control, that I was looking at men as in some ways the enemy, you know, like that there was this divide and that they were this other species, and like, you know, so there was plenty of myself that, if I was being honest, that I could see in pickup artists and the men who are attracted to them, you know, that we were not so different, really. Yeah.
We're all just lost, and when we're lost, we can get cruel without knowing it. Yeah. Speaking of the salsa dancing lawyer with the black Mercedes SUV, again, I know I've blown a lot of smoke up your ass, but the way you tell stories is so, I can just see it. It's so, the shirt open halfway down, you know, it's this, I mean, he's just so visually there, you know. It's really, man, I can't recommend this book too much to people. It's so enlightening, and it's also really enjoyable, you know, to read. It's fun to read, and it's really insightful. Have you heard from any of these guys, any of these exes?
Let's see. So many of them, so I reached out to several men ahead of the publication and was just like, you know, FYI, heads up. And most of them were, you know, I mean, I've kept them anonymous, and most were like, cool, great, like, thanks for letting me know, like, very friendly. I had one ex who was not as happy with it, but I haven't had any, there hasn't been any kind of big conflict or backlash yet, crossing my fingers.
When did the book come out?
It's only been out for, it came out February 16th.
Okay, so very briefly. Yeah. We'll see how it goes. Listen, I promised you we wouldn't go much over an hour, and I know you have a lot going on. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for writing this book. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Thank you so much. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah. So go out and buy it. It's called Want Me. And I was thinking, it's, you know, as I was saying earlier, that it's not written out of ego, and so many memoirs should be called Look at Me, you know?
Right.
and this one is just so fucking honest. It's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Mom, tell people what they can order from the garage.
Okay, in our cottage garage, we have lots and lots of T-shirts. Sex at Dawn, Civilized to Death, Vanthropology, Tangentially Speaking, Paleo Modern, and Talking Out of My Ass.
She didn't like saying that last one.
Then we now have some new things added. We've got beer cozies, or koozies, or whatever they're called.
Oh, Civilized to Death design.
They're all civilized
That's right.
to death.
We have stickers and car decals, right?
Yes.
Okay, there you have it. That's Julie, my mom.
He said, baby, what's a big deal?